So I think there's a few factors that are really sort of driving this attention to condo terminations. Number one, and primarily, is demand, right? There's so much demand for premium sites where you can build premium product there. In Miami Beach, Coconut Grove, Aventura, all these sort of waterfront and prime Class A sites, which you can obviously speak to very well. So there's a lot of demand there. Yeah. But sort of turbocharging that situation is you have a lot of aging condominium buildings. And unfortunately, this has been brought on people's radar because of the tragedy that we had in Surfside, where you had a condominium collapse. All of a sudden, people kind of understand, like, hey, what is the building doing with their reserves? Where are they at with their 40-year certification? Where are they at in this process? So long story short, we had the tragedy of Surfside, where we had a building collapse, and everyone said, how could this happen? Mm-hmm. How could the condominium association let it happen? How could the legislature not have sort of mandatory laws in place? And the immediate Florida legislature session after the Surfside collapse, no new condo laws were passed. And everyone was in shock. Hey, how could our representative officials let us down like this? This tragedy happened. And then there was another session where they passed a wide range of new condo regulations. And primarily out of that is they shortened a lot of the time periods, and this gets hyper technical, we don't need to bore everyone with that, but they shortened a lot of the time periods for these major recertifications of the building. They go through all the major systems to make sure they're compliant. But also, one of the main things, and this sort of came out of Surfside, when they said, well, part of the allegations around that was they said, well, they're fighting over money, and was there money to pay for these big repairs, and why didn't they have mandatory reserves? So some of the new legislation they passed is mandatory reserves that condominium buildings need to have, which are going to be very, very expensive. Now, add to that our high interest rate environment. So, I mean, we're talking billions and billions of dollars of capital needs for these condominium buildings across South Florida. And now with interest rates even higher, before you used to be able to borrow 3.5, 4, like I was getting condominium associations.
Get a loan.
Really easy. There's a lot of lenders that specialize in that type of product. We were in a very low interest rate environment for a while, but now, you're looking at, 6, 7, 8%, and that's just still for, some of the higher end buildings. That's before we can talk about what some of these other kind of Class B, Class C condos are going to do. Yeah. So there's a plethora of factors that are really turbocharging the situation where it currently is very expensive, and it's going to become even more expensive to own and operate a condominium. And so you start to have this economic pressure on the association and their members. Is it really viable to go forward, or should we sell the building and unlock that underlying land value that's there?
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that on condo terminations, right? So the whole idea is that, call it, there's 20 units in a building, but that building sits on very, very valuable land that could be worth, call it, $100 million. But the units themselves, those 20 units, let's say they sell for $500,000 a unit, right? So if you buy up those 20 units, you're paying $10 million, but the land is worth, in this example, $100 million. So a lot of developers are unlocking that land, and we've worked on condo terminations. I think the most sort of pressing one was the 3 acres in Ball Harbor, Carlton Terrace. It took us like 1.5 years to put together and get done. And I remember that some of the unit owners that weren't facing economic pressure, which I think is a great term for all this, they were just saying, no, like, I don't want any amount of money. I just want to live in my building, go away. And I respect it. But with the condo pressures and the new reserves and regulations, now developers or brokers like me that represent some of those unit owners to sell to developers, now it's, hey, do you want to make 3 times your money on your condo, or do you want to pay a $50,000, $100,000 special assessment?
Yeah, and I think that's important. It's a very difficult situation, and it's not necessarily getting easier to solve as South Florida as a whole, particularly residential, gets more expensive. We're not really solving for this problem if people say, well, where do you want me to go? You go ask the average person who owns a $500,000, $750,000 condo on Collins Avenue, that the land might be very valuable, but you say, hey, I'll give you 2 extra money. They say, where do you want me to move to? You want me to move, move my whole life to Broward or farther north or west. So that part right there is a very difficult part to solve, and the reason why, condo terminations are very in vogue right now and splashy headlines, the real deal. They're extremely difficult to pull off. Yeah. And we can get into some of the nuances, and I can give you my take on kind of, there's different ways to do them as opposed to kind of the classic approach. But yeah, it's very difficult to solve the human element of it, number one. Yeah. But you hit the nail right on the head. You hear people throw around special assessments and the economic pressure. Like, these are not $10,000 special assessments.
Right.
These are $50,000 special assessments, $100,000, $200,000 special assessments per unit.
Per unit.
And so that's already difficult if you can finance it and spread those payments out. But in terms of paying in lump sum, or sometimes buildings say, okay, you got to pay it in 1, 2, 3, 4 chunks.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that I realized in working in the Carlton Terrace project was that a lot of these unit owners, even though they live in Bal Harbour, which is, extremely wealthy, they're actually not wealthy. Like, there were 88 unit owners, call it a majority of them just bought their unit in the 80s or 90s and haven't touched it, have just sat on it. But realistically, they bought the unit for $100,000 30 years ago. And their salary or wages or income haven't actually really moved relative to Bal Harbour. So when you're talking about a $50,000 assessment, right? Someone would think, oh, Bal Harbour, they could afford it. But it's not really some of these unit owners that have been.
Yeah, no, you have to parse through the noise and the headlines and the splash. We have a big hype cycle, and there's a lot of PR and marketing and real estate, but to really dive into it, it's exactly like you say, there's a lot of people that they purchased a unit a long time ago, a $50,000 check, it's heartbreaking.
So I work with a lot of the biggest developers in town, and a lot of them are, reaching out to me, talking about condo terminations and trying to get to that land under the building. What's your thoughts on sort of the process in which they're doing this?
So I have a little bit of a controversial take on this. I actually think a lot of developers are going about it in the wrong way. It's very, very difficult to get a controlling interest in the building. I could bore you with all the details of what that exact percentage is. It depends what the condominium documents say. It depends which version of the law it's subject to, but you can get through all that with your attorney. But I think the better route to go about the termination is working directly with the association. At the association level, you first get what's called a conditional termination passed. And you say, hey, members, we want to here's our opinion of value, and maybe even multiple opinions of value. We want to say a strike price of X. We want to now go out and get our votes. We want to get the required vote to terminate on a conditional basis. If we get this price or higher, this plan of termination is now effective. So now you can go out and shop this project and say to your developers when you go out to get bids, I've already got this termination locked up over this price. Instead of trying to do contract by contract by contract by contract, which is some of these buildings is crazy. The amount of people you have to deal with, the personalities, the warring interests and everything. Instead, now you're going to market with a bundled up deal that I think is way more marketable, way more financeable, and way more viable.
So you basically the association goes around asking for a conditional termination, and then unit owners sign up for that?
Yep, and you say, hey, we're all willing to sell. If we get $100 million price, whatever the hypothetical price is, broken down by this, there's a whole discussion if you want to do it per unit or per unit size. And then you would get that voted on pursuant to the governing documents of the condominium and the condominium law. And then now you take this package, you say, hey, I've got this site for you. I've got the termination ready to go. I'm accepting bids of X plus 1, basically.
Yeah. So then the association or whoever's orchestrating that can come to me as a broker and say, hey, if you can get us $100 million for our building, we could sell. And then, obviously I will do my math and say, yeah, we could get you $100 million. Let us go talk to all developers around the world about this.
Exactly.